From the very first page, John Locke lays down a foundational truth, a principle so radical for its time, yet so intuitively appealing, that it continues to echo through centuries of political thought and profoundly influence the course of human history. He begins with a declaration that cuts through the divine right of kings and inherited privilege, asserting unequivocally all men are, by nature, free, equal, and independent. Imagine a world without rulers, without formal laws, without the elaborate structures of government we often take for granted. Locke asks us to picture this state of nature not as a chaotic free-for-all, a war of all against all, but as a realm governed by reason itself. In this natural state, each individual possesses an inherent right to life, liberty, and property, what he famously termed property in the broadest sense, encompassing not just possessions, but our very selves, our labor, and the fruits of it. No one is naturally superior to another, and no one has a divine or inherent right to rule over anyone else. We are born with these rights, not granted them by any earthly power. They are fundamental, preceding any social contract or political organization. This isn't just a philosophical musing, it's the very bedrock upon which, Locke argues, any legitimate government must be built. For him, government isn't some benevolent gift from on high, it's a necessary, yet carefully limited, construct designed to protect these inherent natural rights that we already possess. Now, fast forward nearly a century from Locke's 1689 publication of the Second Treatise. Cross the vast Atlantic Ocean to a fledgling continent on the brink of profound change. Listen closely to the words penned by Thomas Jefferson in 1776, words that ignited a revolution, forged a new nation, and continue to resonate globally as a beacon of liberty. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Does that sound familiar? It should. The resonance is not merely coincidental. It is unmistakable, a direct intellectual lineage. Locke's powerful assertion that individuals are born free and equal, possessing natural rights that predate any government, served as the indispensable intellectual blueprint for the American revolutionaries. His philosophy provided the intellectual ammunition, the moral justification, for their radical act of declaring independence from what they perceived as tyrannical rule. When Jefferson spoke of unalienable rights, he was not inventing a new concept. He was artfully translating and re-articulating Locke's concept of natural rights, rights inherent to our very humanity, not granted by any monarch, parliament, or earthly decree, and thus rights that cannot legitimately be taken away. The colonists didn't simply object to taxes, they objected to the principle behind those taxes, to governance without their consent, to a monarch acting outside the bounds of a legitimate social contract. Locke had provided them with the framework to articulate precisely why the British government had overstepped its bounds and forfeited its right to rule. He articulated that government's sole purpose is to protect these natural rights. When it fails to do so, or worse, actively infringes upon them, its legitimacy crumbles. This idea, radical in its time, challenged the traditional notions of absolute sovereignty and laid the groundwork for modern democratic thought, emphasizing the power and agency of the individual. But Locke's influence extends far beyond merely defining these fundamental rights and their application in the American experiment. He dared to confront one of the most dangerous, yet ultimately liberating and transformative, questions any society can ask: when is it not only permissible, but morally necessary, for a people to rise up and dismantle the government they once consented to? This isn't a question asked lightly, it's a question fraught with immense consequences, one that challenges the very foundations of authority and demands a deep, often painful, examination of the intricate relationship between the governed and their governors. Locke understood implicitly that if government derives its legitimate power solely from the consent of the governed, a concept known as the social contract, then what happens when that consent is systematically violated? What happens when those entrusted with the sacred duty of protecting our natural rights, those rights to life, liberty, and property, instead become their greatest threat, actively undermining the very purposes for which they were established. When a government consistently acts against the trust placed in it by its people, when it infringes upon their liberties and abuses its power, it effectively dissolves itself and breaks the social contract. It ceases to be a legitimate government. This, then, is the burning, profound question at the heart of our exploration, a question that continues to echo in every struggle for freedom and self-determination around the globe. Under what precise circumstances does a people have the right indeed, the moral obligation and the inherent power to reclaim their sovereign authority, dissolve their political bonds, and forge a new path towards a more just and equitable society? Locke meticulously outlines these conditions, providing a powerful, rational argument for revolution, not as a reckless act of rebellion, but as a reasoned, often last resort, defense of natural rights and legitimate governance. His ideas offer a profound framework for understanding not just how governments are formed, but why and when they can, and sometimes must, be overthrown. It's a blueprint for freedom, wrapped in the sober language of political philosophy. Hello, and a warm welcome to this exploration of one of the most profoundly influential works in the history of political thought, John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. I am your narrator, and my role in this journey is far more than simply reading the words aloud. Think of me as your guide, your interpreter, dedicated to building a clear, sturdy bridge between the ideas penned over 3 centuries ago and your understanding today. We'll journey across time, from the intellectual ferment of the late 17th century, right into the complexities of our modern world. Locke's arguments, crafted within a very specific historical crucible, remain astonishingly potent and relevant, shaping debates that continue to echo in our current political landscapes. My aim is to meticulously unpack his language, to clarify his often dense concepts, and to make the profound implications of his philosophy accessible and meaningful for you, the contemporary listener, allowing you to engage with these timeless ideas. To truly appreciate the revolutionary spirit embedded within Locke's treatise, we must first ground ourselves in the historical soil from which it sprang. Picture England in the tumultuous final decades of the 17th century, a nation caught in deep religious division and intense political upheaval. The central, burning question that dominated public discourse and royal courts alike was the very nature of legitimate power. Was it divinely bestowed upon monarchs, an unchallengeable right passed down through bloodlines, or did it somehow originate from the people themselves, who then delegated it? This period of escalating tension reached its dramatic zenith with the events of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. This was not merely a change of monarchs. It was a profound, relatively bloodless, but utterly transformative overthrow of King James II, driven by fear of Catholic absolutism and a desire to protect parliamentary liberties. It marked a seismic shift, when Parliament decisively asserted its legislative supremacy, and the blueprint for a constitutional monarchy, accountable to the rule of law, began to take concrete shape. Locke's 2 treatises of government, though written earlier, was published immediately after these events, serving as the definitive philosophical justification for this radical reordering of the political universe. It provided, in essence, the intellectual scaffold for a new political paradigm, one where authority derived not from the heavens, but from the deliberate consent of the governed, where the power of the state was explicitly limited by the rights of its citizens, and where the people held the ultimate right to shape their own destiny. For many of us, John Locke's Second Treatise is a name we've encountered before, perhaps in a foundational history course, or a survey of political science. It's often presented, quite rightly, as a cornerstone of what we now understand as liberal democracy, a predictable, almost comfortable, champion of individual rights, the rule of law, and limited government. But I contend there is a richer, more challenging narrative beneath that commonly accepted textbook view. Our journey through this text will not be one of mere reaffirmation. Instead, our goal is to peel back those familiar layers, to look beyond the convenient summaries, and to actively deconstruct the conventional understanding. We will venture deeper, To uncover the truly radical core of Locke's philosophy, the audacious, even dangerous, ideas breathtakingly innovative and subversive in his own time, and which, I argue, still carry a surprising revolutionary charge today. This isn't merely an academic exercise in historical interpretation, it's an engagement with a living text, a text that, despite its subsequent canonization, continues to offer profound insights and even uncomfortable challenges to our contemporary political structures, reminding us of popular sovereignty, the inherent right to resist tyranny, and the unalienable equality of all human beings. Prepare yourself to rediscover a work that shaped nations and continues to inspire those who champion liberty and justice. Let us begin our exploration by imagining a fundamental human condition, one that exists before any form of government, before rulers or parliaments, or even formal communities. This is what we call the state of nature. It's a place where we consider humanity before the advent of politics. In this natural state, every individual finds themselves in a condition of perfect freedom. Imagine having the complete liberty to order your actions, and to dispose of your possessions and your person, precisely as you see fit. You are not required to ask permission from, nor are you dependent upon the will of, any other person. Each of us is truly our own master, free from any superior power on earth. Crucially, this freedom is coupled with a profound sense of equality. In the state of nature, no one holds an inherent, natural power or jurisdiction over another. We are all born into the same human species and rank, enjoying the same advantages provided by nature, and possessing the same faculties. To assert that one person naturally rules another would be to deny this fundamental truth, unless a clear declaration from a superior power, like God, distinctly set one above the rest. Now, it's vital to understand that this perfect freedom, this state of absolute liberty, is not a license to do absolutely anything one pleases. The state of nature is not a state of chaos, where every person acts without restraint or consequence. On the contrary, there is a governing principle, a guiding wisdom, that regulates it and binds everyone. This principle is what we refer to as the law of nature. And what does this law of nature dictate? It is reason itself, teaching all mankind, if only they will take the time to consult it. This powerful, inherent reason reveals a fundamental truth: no one ought to harm another in his life, his health, his liberty, or his possessions. This is because we are all equal and independent. No one should be subjected to the power of another unless they have freely consented to it. Consider this further: we are all the workmanship of one omnipotent, infinitely wise Maker God. We are His servants, sent into the world by His order and about His business. We are His property, made to last during His pleasure, not one another's. Therefore, just as each person is bound to preserve themselves, and not to willfully abandon their own existence, so too, by the same logic, when their own preservation does not conflict, they ought to preserve the rest of mankind as much as they can. This means we should not take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of life, such as the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. This foundational understanding of perfect freedom, constrained by natural law and the duty to preserve humanity, is the true starting point for comprehending our shared existence before the advent of political society. It sets the stage for everything that follows. While the state of nature is characterized by reason and peace, there exists another, far darker condition: the state of war. This state of war emerges when any individual, by word or action, declares a deliberate design to use force against another person, without any legal right or justification. Such an act is not merely a breach of peace. It constitutes a direct threat to the very existence of the individual under attack. When someone thus engages in unprovoked force, they instantly place themselves in a state of war with the person they assault. Their actions reveal an intention that goes beyond a simple transgression, an intention to take away life itself, or at least to enslave. Why life? Because seizing a person's liberty, placing them under absolute, arbitrary power, is essentially to take away everything else from them. It means they could be killed at any moment, without resistance. Therefore, anyone who attempts to put another under such absolute power thereby puts themselves into a state of war against that person. Such an aggressor, having abandoned reason and resorting to force, becomes akin to a wild beast, dangerous and predatory. In such a dire situation, the natural law dictates that the person being attacked has an immediate and unquestionable right to self-preservation. This means they are entitled to kill the aggressor, if necessary, to save their own life. It is not merely permissible but a moral imperative to treat such a person as one would treat any common enemy, someone who seeks their destruction. For reason commands us to preserve ourselves above all else, and when someone threatens our life, they forfeit their claim to ours. No one could reasonably wish me to abstain from defending myself when threatened with death, or with the loss of my liberty, which is tantamount to death. This brings us to a crucial distinction that is often misunderstood. The state of nature and the state of war, though sometimes confused, are as distinct as a state of peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation is from a state of enmity, malice, violence, and mutual destruction. The state of nature, as we explored, is governed by reason, where individuals respect each other's rights and strive for peace. There, all people live together according to reason, without a common superior on earth to judge between them. The state of war, however, is born from the use of unjustified force, or a declared intention of it. It occurs when individuals act without right, and violence takes the place of reason. The great reason why people choose to leave the state of nature and form a society is precisely to avoid this state of war. In the state of nature, when a conflict arises, there is no common authority, no impartial judge to appeal to, and no one to execute a just judgment. Thus, every individual must act as their own judge and executioner, which can easily lead to a perpetuation of the state of war. In civil society, however, the establishment of a government provides that impartial authority, that common judge, making an appeal possible, and thereby preventing or ending the state of war among its members. The state of war continues until an impartial judge can resolve the dispute and enforce justice. So remember, the state of war is not merely conflict, it is the deliberate, unlawful use of force, or the clear declaration of such intention, against another. And against such a threat, the natural right of self-defense, even to the point of lethal force, is not just granted, but imperative for self-preservation. We now turn our attention to one of the most foundational concepts in political philosophy, how individuals come to own anything at all. Our journey into Locke's thinking leads us to the surprising yet elegant idea of the labor theory of property, revealing how private ownership emerges from a world initially held in common. The fundamental premise begins with the idea that God, or nature, has given the earth and all its bounty to humanity in common. All resources, the land itself, the fruits it bears, the animals that roam are initially for everyone to share, for their sustenance and comfort. This raises an immediate question: if everything is common, how can any individual ever come to legitimately own a particular apple, a specific piece of land, or a single deer? How does anything move from being the property of all to being the exclusive property of one? Locke's answer to this puzzle is both intuitive and profound. He asserts that while the earth and its fruits are given to all, each individual has an undeniable property in their own person. Your very self, your body, and the work of your hands are uniquely yours. No one else has a right to them. This personal ownership of your being and your actions is the starting point for all other property rights. Therefore, when you take something from the state of nature, something originally common to all, and you apply your effort, your labor to it, you infuse it with a part of yourself. By mixing your labor with it, you make it your own. For example, if you pick an apple from a tree in the wild, that apple, once common, becomes your private property the moment your hand plucks it. The act of gathering, of exerting your energy, removes it from the common stock and annexes it to yourself. It is your labor that has distinguished it from what is common. This principle extends beyond mere gathering. If you hunt a deer, the effort of tracking, capturing, and killing it makes that deer yours. If you cultivate a piece of land, plowing it, planting seeds, and tending to the crops, the land, by virtue of your labor invested in it, becomes your private domain. It's not simply the land, but the improvements and the value your work adds that solidify your claim. Requiring the consent of every person on earth, before you could claim anything as your own would, Locke argues, make private property utterly impossible and effectively starve humanity. This self-originating right to property through labor must be valid. However, Locke immediately introduces a crucial limitation, often referred to as the Lockean proviso. This right to appropriate resources through your labor is not boundless. It operates under the condition that there is still enough, and as good left in common for others. Your act of appropriation must not diminish the opportunities for others to likewise acquire property through their own labor. In the early stages of the world, and indeed in many parts of the globe during Locke's time, this proviso was easily met. There was an abundance of land and resources, so plentiful that taking a portion for yourself through your work would not leave anyone else without their fair share, or without the means to acquire their own. The principle is that no one is harmed by another's industriousness, as long as ample resources remain. Consider the vast uncultivated lands that existed. An acre of wild, untouched ground, Locke suggests, is far less valuable than an acre tilled and planted by human hands. It is labor that adds the overwhelming majority of value to resources. By taking a piece of land and making it productive, you are not robbing others. Rather, you are demonstrating the power of labor to create value where little existed before, provided that there is still room for others to do the same. This system allows individuals to provide for themselves and their families, cultivating industry and improving the land, all while respecting the fundamental common ownership of humanity, ensuring that everyone has the chance to thrive through their own effort. Imagine for a moment the world as it once was, before the advent of elaborate commerce. In that early state, though men could claim property through their labor, there existed a natural, inherent limit to how much one could reasonably accumulate. This limit wasn't imposed by law, but by the very nature of things. It's what we might call the spoilage principle. Think of it this way: you could gather as many apples as your hands could pick, or as much land as your efforts could cultivate. But what good was it to possess more apples than you, or your family, could eat before they withered and rotted? What purpose did it serve to harvest more grain than you could store or consume before it spoiled, becoming a putrid waste of the common stock? Nature itself imposed a boundary. If you took more than you could genuinely use, if your harvest went to waste under your hand, you transgressed the natural law, for you deprived others of what they might have utilized. Our right to property, therefore, was intrinsically tied to our ability to make good use of it without letting it spoil. In this original state, vast inequalities of wealth were practically impossible, simply because perishable goods couldn't be accumulated indefinitely. Each person's possessions were largely constrained by their immediate needs and capacity for direct consumption. But then, a subtle yet profound shift occurred. Humans began to recognize the value of certain durable, non-perishable items. Perhaps it started with shiny stones, rare shells, or perhaps it was the discovery of metals like gold and silver. These were things that did not decay, did not rot, no matter how long they were kept. And crucially, they were rare enough to be valued, yet small enough to be portable. Slowly, by a tacit and mutual agreement, people began to accept these metals, this money, in exchange for their perishable goods. A man could sell his excess plums, which would otherwise spoil, for a piece of silver, knowing that the silver would retain its value indefinitely and could later be exchanged for nuts, or clothes, or whatever else he might need. This invention of money proved to be a game changer. It effectively allowed humans to bypass the natural spoilage principle. No longer was one limited to accumulating only what could be consumed before decay set in. Now, you could accumulate silver and gold, which never spoiled, and thus, store up value without limit. This created a new incentive for labor and productivity. If a man could work more, cultivate more land, or produce more goods, he could now convert that surplus into a non-perishable form of wealth. The fear of waste, the natural limit imposed by spoilage, was lifted. With this new freedom, however, came a new dimension to human society. The voluntary acceptance of money as a store of value, and the possibility of accumulating it without bounds, paved the way for larger possessions and, inevitably, for inequality. Some individuals, more industrious or perhaps more fortunate, could now accumulate significantly more wealth than others. They could possess vast tracts of land, knowing that the produce they could not personally consume could be sold for money, which in turn could buy more land, or more labor, or more goods. While this led to differences in material possessions, it also spurred a profound shift in economic activity. Land, which previously might have lain fallow because its produce couldn't be fully utilized, now became immensely more valuable and productive. The incentive to cultivate and improve land grew exponentially, knowing that any surplus could be converted into lasting wealth. In essence, money, by removing the natural barrier of spoilage, unlocked an entirely new potential for economic growth and human industriousness, even as it introduced the concept of significantly unequal shares among people, all through a voluntary, agreed-upon valuation. This new era, marked by money, transformed our relationship with property and the very fabric of our shared existence. You're listening to a foundational exploration of liberty and government. In our journey, we now turn our attention to a concept often misunderstood and, indeed, misused: the idea of paternal power. This term, as Locke explains, is frequently invoked to justify the absolute authority of monarchs, equating a king's rule with a father's dominion over his children. However, a closer look reveals a crucial distinction, one that utterly dismantles the pretensions of tyranny. First, let's correct the very term itself. Locke clarifies that what we speak of isn't merely paternal power, but parental power. This seemingly small adjustment holds significant weight, for it immediately acknowledges the equal and shared authority of both mother and father in raising their children. This shared responsibility is not about absolute dominion, but rather a natural right and obligation given to parents to nurture, educate, and guide their offspring. It's a temporary authority, exercised for the child's benefit, with a clear end in sight. The purpose of parental power, you see, is to protect and prepare the child for a life of freedom. Children, while not born fully rational, are born with the potential for reason. They are not born into perpetual servitude, but rather into a state where their reason will eventually mature. Until that point, parents provide the necessary governance, making decisions for their children's safety and development, precisely because the children lack the full capacity to reason for themselves. This guidance isn't to crush their will, but to cultivate their capacity for independent thought and action. As a child grows, their understanding develops, their reason strengthens, and their need for parental direction diminishes. Locke asserts that once reason has fully matured, and the child is capable of governing themselves, they are no longer subject to their parents' commands. They become free and equal individuals, just like any other adult. The bonds of affection and respect remain, of course, but the authority of the parent over the child ceases. This natural progression shows that parental power is inherently temporary and conditional, designed to lead to freedom, not to maintain subjection. Now, contrast this with political power. Political power, Locke argues, is exercised over adult, free, and rational individuals. It is not something we are born into, subject to indefinitely. Instead, it is founded upon the consent of the governed and exists for the preservation of their rights and for the common good of society. Unlike parental power, which aims to bring a child to the age of reason and freedom, true political power recognizes and respects the existing reason and freedom of its citizens. This brings us to the crucial point: the debunking of the idea that monarchs are like fathers to their people, holding absolute authority based on a perpetual parental right. This analogy, so often used by those who seek to justify unlimited rule, completely misrepresents the nature of both parenthood and government. Monarchs govern men, not children. They rule over individuals who are, by nature, free, rational, and equal. To suggest that a king holds the same kind of authority over his adult subjects as a father holds over his dependent child is to ignore the fundamental principles of human nature and political society. It implies that adult citizens are perpetually immature, incapable of governing themselves, and therefore require constant, unquestioning submission to a ruler. This notion fundamentally undermines the very essence of liberty. A true father aims to raise his child to independence and self-governance. A ruler who claims paternal power over his people, and thereby seeks to maintain them in a state of perpetual subjection, is not acting as a nurturing parent, but as a tyrant. Such a ruler is not guiding his people towards freedom, but seeking to strip it away. Locke's distinction is vital. Parental power is temporary, natural, and for the benefit of the child's eventual freedom and reason. Political power, on the other hand, is for the preservation of the existing freedom and property of rational adults, based on their consent, and is always limited by law. Conflating these two distinct forms of power is a dangerous error, one that allows for the erosion of individual liberty and paves the way for absolute and arbitrary rule. Understanding this difference is a cornerstone of recognizing legitimate government from oppressive tyranny. We spent some time exploring the state of nature, observing its freedoms and its inherent challenges. Now, let's turn our attention to the pivotal moment when individuals, through their own choice, transition from that natural freedom into an organized civil society. It's a fundamental shift, driven not by coercion, but by a considered understanding of mutual benefit. Remember, in the state of nature, every person is perfectly free and equal, subject only to the law of nature. No one can be pulled out of this state and placed under the political power of another without their own explicit consent. This principle is absolute. The only way anyone truly gives up their natural liberty and enters into civil society is by agreeing with other men to unite into a community. This agreement is made for their comfortable, safe, and peaceful living, with the secure enjoyment of their properties and a greater security against those who are not part of that community. When a group of men thus agrees to form a community or government, they immediately become a single body politic. This body gains the power to act as one, and this power is exercised by the will and determination of the majority. For what else could make a single body act as such, if not the consent of its individual members, and the understanding that the greater force, the majority, should carry the day? Without this principle, the very idea of a collective body is lost, and the original agreement to unite becomes meaningless. So, every individual who agrees to form a body politic under one government also agrees to submit to the determination of the majority. This is the bedrock upon which any legitimate government is built. This mutual agreement, this understanding to forsake certain aspects of natural liberty for collective security, is what we call the social contract. It is a profound exchange. In the state of nature, each individual possessed two significant powers. First, the power to do whatever they thought fit for their own preservation, and the preservation of others, all within the bounds of the law of nature. Second, they held the power to judge and punish any violations of that law committed against them or others. But the exercise of these powers by individuals often led to inconveniences. Our natural partiality towards ourselves and our friends, coupled with passions like revenge, could easily cloud our judgment, making us poor arbiters of justice in our own cases. There was no common, established law, no known and indifferent judge to resolve disputes fairly, and often, no power to enforce a just sentence. These deficiencies rendered the enjoyment of property in the state of nature uncertain and insecure. Therefore, mankind willingly, though constrained by these inconveniences, enters into society. When they do, they surrender those two original powers. The power to act as they see fit for their own preservation is given up to be regulated by laws made by society, laws which are designed for the common good, and the power to punish offenses is entirely given over to the community, to be exercised by its appointed magistrates according to established laws. This is a crucial trade. Individuals give up the executive power of the law of nature, that personal right to judge and punish, and they transfer it to the public. In return for this surrender, they gain an impartial and stable authority. The great purpose of entering into society is the preservation of property, which Locke defines broadly to include life, liberty, and estate. And for this to be secured, there must be established laws, a known judiciary, and an executive power to enforce those laws. Thus, the community itself, through its chosen representatives and institutions, steps in to act as the ultimate umpire. When disputes arise between individuals, they no longer resort to personal judgment or private force. Instead, they appeal to the community. The community, Having established known laws, an empowered and indifferent judge provides a reliable means to settle all controversies according to those laws. It is this presence of a common, indifferent judge with authority, a body to which everyone can appeal and submit, that marks the transition from the state of nature to civil society. Without such an appeal, men remain in the state of nature, no matter how many are gathered together. Therefore, the very essence of civil society lies in the people having this appeal, and the community acting as the supreme arbiter, ensuring justice and protecting the rights of all its members. This is the foundation of lawful government and the secure enjoyment of our collective lives. As we continue our journey into the structure of government, we now turn our attention to the legislative branch, a concept John Locke deems the very soul of a commonwealth. Locke establishes the legislative power as nothing less than the supreme authority within any political society. This is the power to formulate laws that guide and bind the entire community. It is, he asserts, the first and fundamental positive law of all commonwealths, the establishing of the legislative power. Once the people have placed this power in the hands of a particular person or assembly, the entire community is bound to obey the laws it enacts. No decree from any other body or individual can hold the force and obligation of law unless it originates from, or is sanctioned by, this supreme legislative authority. Anything less would be to subvert the very foundation of government and order. However, Locke is quick to emphasize that even this supreme power is not absolute or arbitrary. It is a power held in trust, or as he puts it, a fiduciary power. The people bestow this authority for specific ends, primarily the preservation of society and, by extension, every person within it. The legislative's authority can never justly extend beyond what is necessary for the public good. To act otherwise would be to betray the trust placed in it. This means the legislative cannot govern by sudden, arbitrary decrees. Instead, it must dispense justice and decide the rights of the subject through established, standing laws, which are known and promulgated to all. These laws must be applied equally, without favoritism, to rich and poor, to the powerful and the common citizen alike. The reasoning is clear: the rule of law, not the whims of individuals, ensures stability and justice. If laws were subject to arbitrary change or application, the very security that people seek in forming a society would be undermined. Furthermore, Locke identifies another critical limitation on the legislative's power, one that resonates deeply through history: the principle of property. The supreme power, however absolute it may seem in other respects, cannot arbitrarily take from any man any part of his property without his consent. People enter into society precisely to preserve their property, not to have it seized at the whim of the government. Therefore, no government can justly claim the power to raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people, given either directly by themselves or through their chosen representatives. For if any power could arbitrarily dispose of a person's estate, it would essentially reduce them to a condition worse than the state of nature, where at least they had the right to defend their own. To allow such arbitrary taxation would be to invade the fundamental law of property and, by extension, to subvert the very purpose for which government was instituted. It is a direct violation of the trust placed in the legislative power and a forfeiture of its authority. Once a legislative body has framed and established a set of laws, its primary work of lawmaking is often completed for a period. The act of creating these rules, while supremely important, does not demand constant attention. Laws can be crafted and enacted, establishing a framework intended to last. However, the situation changes fundamentally when we shift our focus to the execution of those very laws. For any legal framework to hold meaning and be truly effective, its principles must be continually upheld, applied, and enforced in daily life. The very purpose of laws is to regulate society's actions, and this regulation is an ongoing, pervasive, and daily necessity. Every transaction, every dispute, every breach of the peace requires immediate and consistent application of the established rules. Therefore, there must always be a power in existence that is continuously active, ensuring these laws are carried out without interruption, ready to act at any moment. This persistent, ever-vigilant force is what we designate as the executive power. It is distinct from the legislative power because its operation is perpetual. It needs to be constantly present and prepared to implement, interpret, and enforce the rules the legislature has laid down, thereby upholding the very fabric of the Commonwealth. Now, let us consider a crucial safeguard essential for any well-ordered and free society, the principle of the separation of powers. It would present an overwhelming temptation for human frailty, that inclination we all possess to grasp for more authority, if the very same individuals who possess the supreme authority to make laws also held the power to execute them. If these two immense powers were combined, the temptation would be incredibly strong for them to create laws specifically tailored to suit their own private interests, rather than the impartial good of the whole community. They might craft legislation exempting themselves from the burdens or constraints of laws they impose on others, or administer these laws in a way that serves their personal advantage. Such a scenario would inevitably lead to rulers pursuing individual ambitions or sectional interests, rather than diligently working for the common good and welfare of the entire society. The risk of tyranny and arbitrary rule would become immense. To prevent this dangerous abuse of power, to safeguard liberty and ensure justice, it is absolutely essential that the legislative and executive powers be placed in different hands. This fundamental division ensures that those entrusted with making laws are themselves subject to them, just like every other citizen, creating a vital check against potential corruption and the accumulation of absolute power. Moving beyond the internal governance and domestic administration of a society, there is another distinct, yet equally critical, power a commonwealth must possess. This is what we refer to as the federative power. While the executive power primarily focuses on applying and enforcing municipal laws within the community's borders, managing internal order, justice, and daily government operations, the federative power concerns itself with all matters pertaining to external affairs. It is the authority to manage the community's interests on an international stage, dealing with all other independent states and peoples. This encompasses the weighty decisions of war and peace, determining when to engage in conflict or seek peaceful resolution. It includes the authority to form leagues and alliances with other states, forging agreements for mutual defense or cooperation. Furthermore, it covers the broad scope of conducting all manner of transactions, treaties, and diplomatic relations with foreign communities. Essentially, the federative power comprehensively deals with the security, prosperity, and overall interests of the public in relation to all entities outside the Commonwealth's immediate jurisdiction. Now, although these two powers, the executive and the federative, are distinct in their specific functions and spheres of operation, they are almost invariably united in practice and placed in the same hands within a well-functioning government. The practical necessity for this union stems from a crucial point. Both powers ultimately require the unified use of the society's force to be effective. Whether it is enforcing a law domestically or responding to a diplomatic challenge or military threat from abroad, the physical might, resources, and coordinated action of the community are often indispensable. To place these two powers in entirely separate, independent hands could lead to confusion, conflicting commands, and a severe breakdown in the smooth and efficient operation of government, particularly in moments requiring swift and decisive action for public safety and welfare. For instance, if the executive could enforce laws but not negotiate treaties or declare war, or vice versa, the government's ability to act coherently would be severely compromised. Therefore, for the sake of efficiency, coherent application of communal force, and prevention of internal discord in matters of vital importance, it is prudent and often absolutely necessary for the same executive body to also wield the federative power, ensuring a singular, unified approach to both internal order and external relations, thereby safeguarding the entire Commonwealth. Welcome back to our exploration of government and civil society, as we delve into Chapter 9, where John Locke introduces us to a fascinating and often misunderstood concept: the power of prerogative. Imagine a situation where the strict application of the law, while generally good, might actually cause harm to the community if followed to the letter in an emergency. Or perhaps, there's an unforeseen circumstance that the law simply doesn't address. This is where Locke argues for the necessity of what he calls prerogative. He defines prerogative as nothing less than the power to act without the explicit direction of the law, and sometimes even against the direct letter of the law, for the public good. It's a discretionary power, a flexibility granted to the executive branch of government, which is responsible for the day-to-day enforcement of laws and the safety of the Commonwealth. Why is such a power needed? Well, human laws by their very nature are general. They cannot foresee every possible scenario or exigency that might arise in the life of a nation. It's simply impossible for a legislature, no matter how wise, to create rules that perfectly cover every single future event. There will inevitably be gaps, or times when rigid adherence to an existing law would actually hinder, rather than help, the preservation of the community. In such moments, a prompt and decisive action is required, an action that might not be prescribed by law, or even one that temporarily suspends a particular law, if it is truly for the greater benefit of the people. Consider, for instance, a sudden natural disaster, a widespread famine, or an imminent threat of invasion. The legislative body, designed for careful deliberation and lawmaking, often moves too slowly to respond effectively to these immediate crises. It falls, therefore, to the executive, the part of government tasked with swift action, to exercise this power of prerogative. This involves making a judgment call, a discretionary action, based on what is best for the people, even when the laws are silent or seem to impede the necessary course of action. However, this concept immediately raises a critical question and highlights a significant danger. A power to act without law, or even against it, sounds alarmingly like arbitrary rule. And indeed, the potential for abuse of executive prerogative is immense. If this discretionary power is not carefully circumscribed and understood, it can easily transform into a tool for tyranny, allowing a ruler to pursue personal interests, consolidate power, or oppress the very people they are meant to serve. The history of governments, Locke reminds us, is rife with examples of executives who, once entrusted with such a power, have used it not for the public good, but for their own ambition, their avarice, or their pleasure. So, how can we ensure that prerogative, while necessary, does not become an instrument of despotism? Who judges whether the executive is truly acting for the public good, or merely under the guise of it, while pursuing private aims? Locke's answer is clear and fundamental to his philosophy: the people are the ultimate judge. While the executive is entrusted with this discretionary power, that trust is always conditional. The people retain the inherent right to judge whether the executive's use of prerogative is consistent with the public good. If a series of acts, or a consistent pattern of behavior, demonstrates that the executive is abusing this power, using it for oppressive purposes, or acting systematically against the welfare of the Commonwealth, then the people have the ultimate authority to resist. They may not have an immediate, legally prescribed mechanism to remove an executive who abuses prerogative, as the laws themselves might be silent on such a situation. But their ultimate power lies in their right to appeal to heaven, as Locke puts it, which means their right to revolution, and to establish a new legislative power when the existing one, through the executive's abuse of prerogative, has fundamentally broken the trust placed in it. Therefore, while prerogative is a vital tool for the effective functioning of government, allowing for adaptability and swift action in unforeseen circumstances, it is also a double-edged sword. Its legitimacy stems solely from its consistent application for the public good, and its ultimate check rests with the people, who, as the original source of all legitimate political power, must always remain the final arbiters of whether that power, even when discretionary, is being exercised justly and for their benefit. It is a power granted on trust, and that trust, once broken, justifies the people in reclaiming their original liberty. As we continue our exploration of government, we now turn to a critical distinction: the difference between legitimate rule and its dangerous perversion. This chapter, defining tyranny, cuts to the heart of what happens when power goes wrong, when it is wielded not for the common good, but for selfish ends. John Locke makes it explicitly clear that tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right. This isn't merely about an abuse of authority, it's a fundamental perversion of the very purpose of governance. Legitimate power, according to Locke, is inherently bestowed for the good of the community, for the preservation of its people and their property, all guided by established and known laws. But when any individual in authority, irrespective of their office or title, utilizes that power not for the benefit of the public, but for their own distinct, separate, and private advantage, they immediately transgress into the realm of tyranny. It is this shift from public service to private self-interest that marks the defining characteristic of tyrannical rule. Now, let's delve deeper into a crucial principle Locke articulates: where law ends, tyranny begins. This isn't just a pithy statement, it's a profound declaration about the limits of governmental authority. In a truly free society, the rule of law is supreme. It provides predictability, justice, and protection. Therefore, as soon as a ruler, whether they are a king, a magistrate, or even a legislative body, exceeds the authority expressly granted to them by the community's laws and begins to issue commands arbitrarily, they cease to function as a legitimate governor and become a tyrant. They are no longer operating under the shared rules that bind everyone, but are instead imposing their own unconstrained will. The moment power becomes independent of and superior to the law, the people are no longer living under a government, but under an oppressive force. The true mark of tyranny, then, is not the absence of power, but the exercise of power without the sanction of law, for purposes contrary to the public good. It's vital to understand that this definition of tyranny is not restricted by the form of government or the social standing of the ruler. Locke insists that anyone, regardless of their position, can be a tyrant if they act solely for self-interest, rather than for the good of those they govern. This applies equally to the most powerful monarch as it does to the humblest constable who abuses his authority. Even a king, often traditionally seen as being above reproach or beyond the law, can descend into tyranny. If a king acts out of personal ambition, driven by a desire for revenge, or motivated by insatiable greed, or any other private passion, and in doing so, disregards the fundamental laws designed to protect the lives, liberties, and estates of his subjects, he is no less a tyrant than any petty official who exploits their limited power. The critical distinction lies in the manner of exercising power. Is it exercised according to law for the public good, or arbitrarily for private gain? The office itself grants no immunity from the charge of tyranny if the actions betray the trust placed in it. Therefore, legitimate government operates strictly within the well-defined bounds of law, with the express aim of securing the common good and the prosperity of all its citizens. Tyranny, conversely, is the arbitrary use of power against right, in direct opposition to the very laws that were established to protect individual liberty and property. It represents a profound betrayal of the social contract, a breaking of the fundamental bond of trust between the governing and the governed. When power oversteps its legitimate boundaries, when it willfully disregards the public good in favor of private advantage, that, in John Locke's profound analysis, is precisely the moment tyranny takes hold. And recognizing this crucial distinction is absolutely essential for individuals and communities to understand when a government, irrespective of its outward appearance or historical legacy, has fundamentally strayed from its true and righteous purpose. We arrive now at a crucial point: understanding what causes the dissolution of government. Before we proceed, it's vital to distinguish between two distinct forms of breakdown. The first, and most straightforward, is the dissolution of society itself. This happens, for example, when a foreign power conquers a commonwealth. When a society is thus overthrown, its government cannot possibly endure. After all, the government is merely a creation of the society. If the foundation is destroyed, what rests upon it must also fall. But there is another form of dissolution, far more complex and internal. This occurs when the society remains intact, but the government established within it breaks apart. This is the scenario we must examine closely, for it leads us directly to the question of who holds ultimate power when the structure of governance fails. John Locke argues that the primary cause for the dissolution of government, while society continues, is the alteration of the legislative power. Think of the legislature as the very soul of the Commonwealth. It is the unifying force, the source of law, and the expression of the people's collective will. When this legislative body is altered, broken, or prevented from acting, the entire government is essentially dissolved. The original compact, the agreement by which people consented to be governed, depended on the establishment of this particular legislative power. If that power is changed, the foundation upon which the people gave their obedience crumbles. Consider the various ways this alteration might occur. Locke identifies several key scenarios where those in power betray their trust and, in doing so, dissolve the government. The most common culprit he points to is the executive power often embodied by a prince or monarch when it oversteps its bounds. For instance, if the executive prevents the legislative assembly from meeting and acting freely, it effectively removes the legislative power altogether. The people established their laws through representatives. To hinder these representatives is to usurp the law-making authority, imposing instead the arbitrary will of a single individual. This is a direct assault on the very purpose of civil society. Furthermore, the government is dissolved if the executive replaces the established laws with his own arbitrary decrees, without the consent of the people or their representatives. When the executive can simply ignore or override the laws made by the legislative, it fundamentally shifts the balance of power and destroys the rule of law. The executive's role is to enforce the laws, not to create or negate them at whim. Another significant act of betrayal occurs if the executive alters the methods of election or the very composition of the legislature. If the people's ability to choose their representatives freely and fairly is undermined, then the legislative body no longer genuinely represents the people. It becomes a mere facade, a tool of the executive, and the true legislative power, that is, the will of the society, is lost. Finally, a government is unquestionably dissolved when the executive delivers the people, or any part of them, into the subjection of a foreign power. This is the ultimate act of treason against the Commonwealth. The very reason people entered into society was to protect their lives, liberties, and estates from foreign domination. To voluntarily hand them over to an external authority is to utterly destroy the purpose of their political union and surrender their collective identity. These scenarios all speak to the executive's abuse of power. However, Locke also makes it clear that the legislative power itself can be dissolved when it acts contrary to the trust placed in it by the people. The people grant power to their representatives for one overriding purpose: the preservation of their lives, liberties, and estates, what Locke calls their property and the public good. Therefore, if the legislative body attempts to invade the property of the subject, or reduces them to slavery under arbitrary power, it forfeits the power the people had entrusted to it. When the legislature acts with the intention of destroying, enslaving, or impoverishing the people, it places itself in a state of war with the people. When any part of the government, be it the executive or the legislative, acts against this fundamental trust, the government is dissolved. In such instances, the power reverts to the people. They regain the right to act as supreme, to provide for themselves by erecting a new legislative body, and to establish a form of government that they deem best suited to their safety and welfare. This is not a right to rebellion lightly undertaken, but a return to the original power of the people when their established political structure has been irremediably broken. Some might argue that such a doctrine lays a perpetual foundation for rebellion, enabling every disgruntled faction to overturn the government. Locke strongly refutes this. He observes that people are inherently slow to change their established forms of government. They will endure a long train of abuses, errors, and inconvenient laws before they are roused to action. It is only when there is a clear, evident, and deliberate design against their liberties and properties, a long series of oppressive actions that make the ruler's intentions unmistakable, that the people will finally exercise their right to dissolve the government and establish a new one. This right, far from promoting instability, actually acts as a crucial check on tyranny, reminding rulers that their authority is derived from the people and is held in trust, not by divine right or absolute power. It is the ultimate safeguard against those who would abuse their position and betray the very people they are sworn to serve. We began our journey by imagining humanity in its most primal state, the state of nature. Here each individual was perfectly free, bound only by the universal law of nature, which dictated that no one ought to harm another in life, health, liberty, or possessions. Yet, this state, though free, presented its inherent challenges: a lack of impartial judges to resolve disputes fairly, and an absence of a common power to effectively enforce justice. This inherent instability, this constant threat to security, led rational individuals to seek a more secure and stable existence for themselves and their families. Through a deliberate act of consent, individuals willingly entered into a social contract. They agreed to surrender a portion of their absolute freedom and personal executive power, forming a political society. This decision was not made to diminish their fundamental rights, but rather to secure and protect them more effectively under a common, agreed-upon framework. The primary purpose was unequivocally clear: to create a civil society that would safeguard their property, a broad term encompassing their lives, their liberties, and their estates. From this foundational agreement, from this shared purpose, legitimate government emerged. This government, in whatever form it might take, be it monarchy, aristocracy, or democracy, derives its just powers solely from the consent of the governed. Its primary and indispensable function is to serve the very people who established it, acting as a trusted steward or trustee of their collective rights. This trust is primarily exercised through the establishment of known, settled laws, applied impartially and equally to all citizens. But what happens, we must ask, if this sacred trust is profoundly betrayed? What if those entrusted with power act systematically and repeatedly contrary to the very ends for which they were instituted? Here lies the critical, perhaps most controversial, juncture of our political philosophy: the reserved right of the people to resistance, and in extreme cases, to revolution. If the legislative or executive power systematically, persistently, and openly oversteps its legitimate bounds, if it begins a calculated campaign to enslave or destroy the people's property, then it fundamentally forfeits its authority. It effectively dissolves itself as a legitimate government. In such a dire circumstance, the ultimate power, the original power, reverts back to the community itself. The people then regain their inherent right to establish a new legislative power, to alter the existing one, or to establish an entirely new form of government better suited to protect their inalienable rights. This doctrine is not, as some might hastily assume, an invitation to chaos, but rather a profound and necessary safeguard against absolute tyranny. Now, some might genuinely fear that such a doctrine, asserting the people's right to resistance, would inevitably lead to constant unrest and the perpetual crumbling of all governments. They might argue that if people can overthrow their rulers for any perceived slight, for every legislative misstep, society would be plunged into interminable disorder and anarchy. But this concern, I firmly contend, fundamentally misunderstands both the enduring nature of human society and the inherent patience of humanity. People, in truth, are not so quick to abandon their established forms of government, even when facing significant grievances. They are, by and large, creatures of habit, deeply accustomed to their existing laws, their traditional institutions, and the magistrates who enforce them. They will endure many hardships, suffer much inconvenience, and tolerate a good deal of misgovernance and error for the sake of maintaining peace and stability. The natural inclination of humanity is overwhelmingly toward order and continuity, not capricious rebellion. It is only when a long train of abuses, prevarications, and artifices becomes undeniably clear and widely understood, a deliberate and persistent design by the rulers to subject them to absolute arbitrary power, that the people will finally, and with profound reluctance, rouse themselves to action. It is only when they feel a profound, widespread, and undeniable conviction that their fundamental rights are being systematically eroded, that their very survival as free individuals under the current regime is jeopardized, that they will seriously consider an appeal to heaven. This appeal to heaven is the ultimate right of self-preservation, when earthly remedies have demonstrably failed. Such moments of collective uprising are rare and born of extreme, felt necessity, not fleeting passion or trivial complaints. Our political framework, therefore, does not encourage frivolous or hasty rebellion. Instead, it provides a necessary, albeit grave and last resort, remedy when government itself, through its actions, becomes the primary aggressor against the very rights and liberties it was established to protect. This foundational principle ensures that the ultimate power, the ultimate verdict on the legitimacy of governance, always resides with the people, for whose collective benefit and protection government alone exists and holds its sway.